Planet, Industrial Britain, Food Systems and World Ecology from Chicago last year. He's a specialist in the history of technology and the material world, the history of food, the history of health and disease, and British history. He was educated at the universities of Oxford, Exeter, and Manchester in his native United Kingdom before moving to the US. And he currently, if we were on campus, would be at a building very close to mine in Columbus, Ohio. Of course, none of us is actually on campus. I'm going to make my introductions fairly brief so that we can have get at the shall I say, the meat of the conversation. But Professor Otter is currently writing a new history of the Earth's technosphere as the material milieu in which all human history has unfolded. So he's trying to tackle the fundamental problems which face our species today: inequality, violence, climate change, and epidemic diseases, all of which we are personally, many of which we are personally experiencing, but all of which also connect very well with the conversation of our panel today. Our other speakers will be Sarah Cameron, Daria Mattingly, and Frank Dikötter. And Professor Otter will moderate the conversation among our three panelists. So the physical locations of all of our speakers represent the fact that this is truly a global comparative panel. We're going to start with Professor Sarah Cameron, who is a historian of Russia and the Soviet Union, located in Maryland, right near DC, here in the United States. Her research interests include genocide and crimes against humanity, environmental history, and societies and cultures of Central Asia. And today she will draw primarily on her first book, published by Cornell University Press in 2018. The Hungry Steppe, Famine, Violence, and the Making of Soviet Kazakhstan examines one of the most heinous crimes of the Stalinist regime, the Kazakh Famine of 1930 to 1933, which killed more than 1.5 million people, about a quarter of Soviet Kazakhstan's population. Professor Cameron's research draws on sources in Russian and in Kazakh and reveals the devastating consequences of Stalin's policy for Kazakh society. Her book has won numerous prizes, and I read it has also been translated into both Russian and Kazakh. As much as a study of the politics of food and famine, this book also enters the conversation about environmental issues. And Professor Cameron's new project is on the transformation of the Aral Sea in Central Asia, and thus also contributes to environmental history. Second, we're going to draw into the conversation Professor Daria Mattingly, who is currently writing a book on the traces of the rank and file perpetrators of the 1932-33 famine in Ukraine, known as the Holodomor. Her research interests include perpetrator studies, which is a term I find fascinating from her work, and the social and cultural history of the Soviet Union with an emphasis on Ukraine. In her published research already, Professor Mattingly has looked at various populations and how they have been portrayed in both fiction and cultural memory. And I want to highlight in particular her article, Enforcing National Memory, Remembering Famine's Victims, the National Museum Holodomor Victims Memorial, which came out last year in Steve Norris's new Museums of Communism, New Memory Sites in Central and Eastern Europe from Indiana University Press. And also I found fascinating her title, Extraordinary Women, Female Perpetrators of the Holodomor, which was in the 2019 volume, Women and the Holodomor Genocide, Victims, Survivors, Perpetrators, edited by Victoria Malko. So Professor Mattingly is faculty at Cambridge University, and she'll come to us today from England. Now, finally, our third panelist is Professor Frank Dicoter, who comes to us from Hong Kong, where he has been Chair Professor of Humanities since 2006. And because of the time difference, he will actually be present in a recorded conversation from last week. Professor Dicoter is the author of The People's Trilogy, a series of prize-winning books that document the impact of communism on the lives of ordinary people in China. The first volume of that trilogy was Mao's Great Famine, the history of China's most devastating catastrophe. I'm excited to be able to bring all of these scholars together today, or sort of together, today, to talk about this important topic. Bringing in Professor Dikötter's slightly later view of a different dictator and his policies will help us to contextualize the Kazakh and Ukrainian cases, which have been much in the news of late, in part because of last year's film, Mr. Jones, about a Western journalist who witnessed the Holodomor, and the recent nomination just a few days ago of the Kazakh film, The Crying Steppe, for the 2021 Oscars competition. Before passing the microphone to Professor Otter, I might also note that Professor Dikötter was born in the Netherlands and educated in Switzerland before studying for his PhD in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and then eventually moving to Hong Kong. And as an undergraduate, he majored in both history and Russian, which brings us kind of full circle. So Chris, can you take over for me, and I will disappear and sit back and listen to this conversation.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you for the generous introductions of us all. We've got 2 hours. I don't want to waste any more time speaking. And so we're going to begin with Sarah. Off you go if you want to share your screen with us.
Yeah, great. So can you all hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. All right. So first, before getting started, I'd like to thank Angela for organizing all of this. It's a really wonderful opportunity to share examples from our different cases. Also, I thank Chris for serving as our discussant. My fellow panelists, it's really a pleasure to be here, and also to the entire staff of the center. So let me share my screen. And okay. Okay, so today I'll be talking about the subject of my recently published book, The Kazakh Famine of 1930 to 33. This crisis led to the death of roughly 1.5 million people perished in it. That was approximately 1/3 of all Kazakhs, which makes it, Kazakhs are believed to have the highest death ratio due to collectivization of any people in the Soviet Union. Kazakhs who speak their own Turkic language that's distinct from Russian, they became a minority in their own republic. And they do not constitute more than 50% of the population in Kazakhstan, again, until after the Soviet collapse. Another important feature of the Kazakh case, which is of course quite distinct from the other 2 cases that we'll be looking at, and I think it's important to emphasize, is that the Kazakh famine constitutes one of the largest pastoral famines in modern history. Prior to the crisis, most Kazakhs practice pastoral nomadism. They carry out seasonal migrations to pasture their animal herds along predefined routes. You can see an image of a pastoral nomad here to the left. But due to the utter decimation of their animal herds during this famine, most Kazakhs who survive this crisis are forced to settle. And this leads to a very painful and far-reaching reorientation of Kazakh culture and identity, something that I'll talk a little bit later about in my presentation. And for Kazakhs who lived through these hungry years, the experience of the famine was deeply traumatic. D. Albekov, who got, in his words, quote, a taste of starvation, living through the famine as a young child, noted, quote, today I tell people I don't remember the famine. The scars from this famine haunt the Republic, Kazakhstan, throughout the remainder of the Soviet era, and they also profoundly shape its transformation into an independent nation in 1991. Arguably today, the Kazakh famine, although it is one of the great crimes of the Stalinist regime, it's still not very well known in the West. And in Kazakhstan itself, the issue of the famine remains a partially forbidden topic, we can say. You can see here the former president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, speaking here at a dedication of a famine memorial. If you can believe it, I actually was that close to him. I took that picture myself, which is pretty neat. This famine dedication is quite unusual because in general, we can say that the current Kazakhstani government has been largely reluctant to raise the issue. There are many reasons for this, but probably the most important one is their very close relationship with Russia. So even in Kazakhstan itself, the issue has not really fully been brought to light or explored. So I want to turn next to the causes of the famine. So the primary trigger for the Kazakh famine is collectivization, a topic that you will be hearing a lot about today as part of our session. Collectivization across the Soviet Union, it's launched in the winter of 1929 to 1930. And Moscow sought, by forcing rural people to give up their land and their livestock and enter collective farms, Moscow sought to tighten control over the food supply and boost the Soviet Union's production of meat and grain. It was an economic assault, but it's also important to stress that collectivization was a cultural assault as well. Through the institution of the collective farm, the regime sought to sever local networks, firmly implant Soviet power in the countryside. This was an area, of course, that the Bolsheviks, who were an urban-based regime, they had long struggled to control major grain-growing regions. As collectivization proceeded, major grain-growing regions, such as Ukraine, of course, we'll hear more about in a minute, parts of the Russian heartland, and of course, Kazakhstan, the subject of my research, suffer acutely from collectivization. And across the Soviet Union, some 5 to 9 million people perish in horrifying famines. So this is the kind of broader backdrop, and then I'll turn to the specifics of my case. So in Kazakhstan, like areas further west, the major cause of the famine, one of the major causes, was the forced grain requisitions that accompanied collectivization. Local cadres confiscated grain. That grain was then intended to be funneled to feed hungry workers in cities, or it was also sold abroad to gain the hard currency that the Soviet Union needed to industrialize. I just want to, is my screen freezing up? No? Okay, it must just be on my end. I can just see my, my own image kind of freezing up, but as long as you hear me, that's good. Meat procurements, local cadres then confiscated grain that was funneled to feed hungry workers in cities, and they also sold it abroad to gain the hard currency that they needed, the Soviet Union needed to industrialize. Meat procurements, another feature of collectivization, imposed a special burden on Kazakh pastoralists, given that they were nomads and that animals were really crucial to their nomadic way of life. Kazakhs' animal herds were slaughtered to feed Moscow and Leningrad, but they were also casualties of an attempt to basically transition. In addition, there were casualties of this attempt to transition Kazakhstan from a society that was based around long-distance animal herding to a kind of network of slaughterhouses and meat combines. Prior to the famine, Kazakhstan had been the Soviet Union's largest livestock base, but by the end of the famine, actually some 90% of the animals in the Republic perished. We can see that major causes of the famine were meat and grain procurements that accompanied collectivization. It's very doubtful that famine would have broken out anywhere without the Soviet regime's radical policy interventions. But in my book, and I want to stress here, I think we can also see the legacies of Russian imperial rule as a major contributing factor. During the 19th century and early 20th centuries, when the Kazakh steppe is under Russian imperial rule, more than 1.5 million peasants from Europe and Russia settled the region. Key changes then that were peasant settlement.
Sarah, we're having a lot of trouble with the sound. I'm not sure if there's anything we can do. It's quite crackly. Can you hear me? So I don't know if there's what we can do on your end to improve it.
I mean, would it make sense for us to go ahead with Daria's paper and then come back?
Sarah, have you been having trouble with your internet today, generally? Because there are a lot of disturbances on the East Coast with some crazy stuff going on, with some fiber optic problems. Sarah?
We can't hear you.
Hmm.
The picture is good now, though.
One thing might be to turn off the video
try turning off the video and seeing if that helps.
On Sarah's camera. Sarah, can you hear us? I don't know why, if she can't hear us.
Sarah, maybe you might want to try, I hate to say this, but maybe try leaving the meeting and then coming back to see if maybe that will work.
We should have gotten, there we go. Let's try it again. Sorry, everybody.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let me, how far, where did it start? Where did it start to break up? Like, where should I start again?
It got progressively worse over the last 4 minutes or so.
Okay.
And the last couple of minutes were really difficult to listen to.
Okay. All right.
Maybe the previous slide, and also just make sure to turn your video off, your own personal video. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sorry, my PowerPoint now is acting up. It's a day of I'm not really sure what is going on. Okay, so I think I've figured it out here. Okay, so I'll back up. I'll back up one slide here. So can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, and backing up one slide sounds perfect.
Okay, all right, sorry. I'll try to expedite the rest of my presentation so I don't take up too much time with this. So basically, as I was outlining, in Kazakhstan, like areas further west, the major cause of collectivization is grain procurements. And then, of course, also meat procurements play a big role. Kazakhs are pastoralists. This is the basis of their diet. By the famine's end, really, we see some 90% of the animals in the Republic had perished. And this is in large part what forces Kazakhs to become a settled society. I do want to also stress that the Kazakh crisis, it was not simply a Soviet creation. And this is something I bring out in my book more, that the legacies of Russian imperial rule were an important contributing factor. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, more than 1.5 million peasants from European Russia settled the Kazakh steppe. Peasant colonization prompts significant alterations to Kazakhs' migration routes, consumption patterns, and it makes Kazakhs more susceptible to hunger. So it's clear that it's very doubtful that famine would have broken out anywhere in the Kazakh steppe without the Stalinist regime's policy interventions. But I think we can say that the legacies of Russian imperial rule were an important contributing factor. So moving on, I just want to give you an overview here of some of the key events of the Kazakh disaster. I'll bring out, thinking ahead to Frank's presentation on the Great Leap Forward, I will bring out the role of violence and its place in the Kazakh famine, but I do also want to stress the role of environmental factors. That isn't a subject that he dwelled as much on, but I think it is pretty important to understanding the Kazakh case. So during the first phase of Soviet rule, the period 1921 to 1928, Soviet officials struggled to fit Kazakh nomads and the arid environment of the steppe into their Marxist-Leninist worldview. If you think about—
Can you make sure to share your screen again?
It is shared.
I don't see it. Does everybody see it?
No, I can't see it either. I assumed that you weren't showing it because you just wanted to speak to us, and this would, I think when you switch your video off, it went out too.
Oh no, okay.
We can hear you clearly.
Yeah, you could just do it without. We're fine listening to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I spent a lot of time. Let me, I'll try to fix the PowerPoint. Okay. So can you see my PowerPoint now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right.
And we can hear you clearly.
Yeah, so this was the image that I meant to show when I was talking about collectivization. Here was my slide for the legacies of Russian imperial rule, and now I'm at the point where I wanted to talk about some of the famine's kind of key events. So I'll stress, as I mentioned, I want to stress the role of violence and also environmental factors. During the first days of Soviet rule, Soviet officials really struggled to fit Kazakh nomads and the arid environment of the steppe into their Marxist-Leninist worldview. If you think about what Marxist-Leninist thought was, it didn't give a lot of guidance as to how this was an ideology that was developed among the working class in England. It was one leap to apply it to the peasants of Russia, and then it's a whole nother leap to apply it to the nomadic peoples of Central Asia. There wasn't a lot of guidance for how to do this. And one key issue that preoccupied many planners was the Republic's environment. You can see this slide here that I've put of the map of different climate zones. There was a lot of land in the Kazakh steppe, but much of it was arid, salinated, or otherwise unsuitable for farming. The steppe was also prone to frequent and pronounced ecological shifts. Rainfall patterns could vary dramatically from year to year. The distribution of high quality soils could change. And you would often get a situation where you might get a very plentiful harvest one year and a bad harvest the next. And some experts within the Republic's Commissariat of Agriculture argue that, look, seasonal nomadism, that's the best use of the landscape. And they argue that any attempt to settle the Kazakh nomads is going to result in catastrophe. By 1928, we can see that this period of fluidity had ended. Aspects of Kazakh's practice of pastoral nomadism bring it into tension with proposals for more rapid industrialization. There's an assault on Kazakh elites, which is named the Little October, which begins in 1928. It's so named the Little October because experts in Moscow believed that Kazakhstan was so backward that it had yet to undergo the October Revolution, and this was their way of bringing October belatedly to the steppe. Moscow empowered Kazakhs to carry out this campaign against other Kazakhs. So one thing my research has highlighted is often we might think of campaigns of ethnic violence as done by Russians or done by outsiders, but one of the ways that this campaign was so destructive is that it really begins to unravel Kazakh society from within. Kazakhs are pitted against other Kazakhs. The assault on nomadic life intensifies with the launch of forced collectivization across the Soviet Union in the winter of 1929 to 1930. Moscow proposes to settle and collectivize Kazakh nomads simultaneously, an approach that comes to be known as sedentarization on the basis of full collectivization. By 1930, Stalin and Central Committee members received several early reports of Kazakh suffering, but the regime sends in actually various groups to the Republic in 1930, special settlers, free agricultural colonists, and peasants, and they seize Kazakhs' land for these new arrivals. This intensifies the pressure on the food supply. Finally, in the summer of 1931, the predictions of several experts that the Republic would endure periodic dry spells, they clearly identified for the regime how these environmental factors would operate. This comes to pass. Northern Kazakhstan suffers a severe drought. This leads to a particularly poor harvest. Despite pleas from the Republic's leadership, the Central Committee does not adjust the amount of grain that the Republic was to deliver to Moscow, and the Republic's residents were forced to make up the grain shortfall. Kazakhs respond to this through their massive uprisings, some of the Soviet Union's largest. there's a mass migration of people. About approximately 1 million starving refugees enter into flight. And the Kazakh crisis is distinct from some of the other collectivization famines that occurred in the Soviet Union during the same time period, also due to the scale of the flight that it sets it really quite apart. We don't see this level of flight elsewhere. I do want to stress also that Soviet repressions in response to this hunger were extraordinarily brutal. Just to give you a couple examples, thousands of people, refugees, are slaughtered on the Sino-Kazakh border while trying to cross into Xinjiang. The Soviet Union closes Kazakhstan's borders with neighboring republics. Districts are blacklisted, meaning that residents were essentially entrapped in zones of where you could not get any food. Some of these tactics are imported from other regions, but others are done in Kazakhstan before being used in other famine-stricken regions. So I think the case of Kazakhstan also illustrates and makes us think a bit differently about the circulation of these brutal tactics throughout the Soviet Union. So what are some of the effects of this crisis on Kazakhstan? The famine itself came to an end in 1934. This, of course, is just the beginning of a very long and agonizing period of recovery. At least 1.5 million people, roughly a quarter of the republic's population, perished, and that adds a quarter of the republic's population, but a third of all Kazakhs. Those Kazakhs who survived the famine found their previous way of life destroyed. Due to the decimation of their livestock herds, as I mentioned, about 90% of their livestock dies. They could no longer continue their seasonal migrations. They're forced to settle. Pastoral nomadism, which is one of the defining features of the Eurasian steppe for more than 4 millennia, is eliminated as an economic system. Kazakhstan now today is one of the top wheat producing nations in the world, and I think we can trace the roots of that to this period, to the famine. There's also a profound shift in identity, which I discuss in greater detail in my book. Prior to the famine, one of the most important principles of Kazakh identity was nomadism, being a nomad. But after the crisis, nationality became the crucial principle of organizing of identity for most Kazakhs. So turning to my last slide here, and to conclude, I do want to stress that the topic of the famine in Kazakhstan is in many senses an unfinished one. The famine, as I highlighted in the beginning of my talk, it's a partially forbidden topic in Kazakhstan today. There has been no full or open investigation of the issue in independent Kazakhstan. We have many key questions that we still do not understand very well. Just to highlight a couple of them. One is the death toll. If you contrast the Kazakh case with the Ukrainian case, in the Ukrainian case, there has been a very exhaustive and very eye-opening investigation into this by a team of demographers at Harvard. In the Kazakh case, I can only give you rough estimates ranging from 1.3 to over 2 million. So there is an enormous amount of work to be done on the death toll. We do not understand very well yet how the famine itself broke down regionally, which is really important. I think we need these tools in order to better understand how different causal factors operated with one another. We also do not yet understand the famine's long-term impact on demography and on human health. So researchers working on other famines have shown that not only is there reduction in births during a famine, but survivors and their offspring can experience a decrease in life expectancy, an increase in medical problems such as cancer, diabetes, and so on. This work has not been done for the Kazakh case. And on a most basic level, we still don't know where most of the famine dead are buried. And this is a source of continuing grief and sorrow to many of those who lost family members during this crisis. And I'll just conclude with this image here of, it's a group of Kazakhs who became extremely frustrated by the regime's the lack of discussion of the issue in Kazakhstan. And so they've erected a memorial here to their ancestors who died trying to flee to China. So the memorial is on the Sino-Kazakh border. It's a privately funded memorial, not something done through the auspices of the state. So thanks for bearing with me and the technical problems, and I look forward to hearing more about the other cases.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for struggling so gamely and successfully with the whatever dark forces were trying to derail your talk there. We're going to turn quickly now to Daria Mattingly, who's going to give us the Ukrainian case. So off you go, Daria.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the introductions. And I'm very delighted to be on this panel to talk about the 1932-33 famine in Ukraine, known as the Holodomor, which happened straight after the case Sarah just discussed in her presentation. And I immediately explain why I mean by the Holodomor. So I refer to the specific period roughly late 1932 to the first half of 1933, within the old Soviet famine, which covered many parts of the Soviet Union, as been discussed, including Ukraine. So the famine in Ukraine, in fact, started in 1931. There were already parts of Ukraine where the famine ravaged, but it was, there are a number of policies which exacerbated the famine in Ukraine even further. And a number of historians, including Andrei Graziosi, Lyudmila Hrinevich, and other Ukrainian historians, they distinguish this period as a famine within the famine. And exploring similarities between the famine in Ukraine and differences between the famine in Ukraine and the famine in Kazakhstan and in China contributes to our understanding of current events in Ukraine, how the famine is remembered, studied, and interpreted in Ukraine today, actually. So my research is primarily about the people who facilitated the famine on the ground. But of course, it's not limited to that. And I use in my research primary sources, starting from the private archives to archives on the village level, district, oblast or provincial archives, and Republican. And I also use memoirs, diaries, interviews, post-memory. Obviously, interviews are a handful, but nevertheless. And I do borrow approaches from the studies of other cases of mass violence and genocide, and including perpetrator studies. So my plan today is first to look at the similarities, but obviously my knowledge of other famines is limited, hence this panel is so invaluable to me in particular, and then differences before reaching some conclusions. So I will start with similarities. So, and as Sarah mentioned, for the Soviet authorities, it was unprecedented how to settle the nomads. But also, when it comes to collectivization, it was setting the precedent in building socialism and industrializing such a vast country. And I think every part of the Soviet Union had its unique features, and Ukraine was no exception. So obviously, there is this model of collectivization and building socialist countryside. It's fairly simple. You take food, you sell it on the world market, and you fund the industry and you modernize the country. But first, you have to establish monopoly on grain, and you have to collectivize. You have to set the collective farms. So if peasants, and then you procure grain and sell it. And if peasants fail to provide you a certain type of agricultural produce, you confiscate something else in lieu of that produce. For example, if Ukrainian peasants fail to provide enough grain, so potatoes can be taken away, carrots, cabbage, livestock, valuables, you name it. And of course, this led to starvation even before 1932. As Sarah mentioned, collectivization started 2 years prior to that. And but that famine was nothing of the scale that was to follow in 1932-33 in Ukraine. So that is similar between these famines in China, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. So this state monopoly and obviously coercion and enforcing violence. Another, which I find similar between Chinese case and Ukrainian case is that both for Mao and for Stalin, in some respect, collectivization and enforcing it was the element of the power struggle. For Mao, it was his leadership in the socialist camp, but for Stalin, since he was setting the precedent, and we know about the debates within the party on collectivization, its speed and what to collectivize, how to collectivize, all these approaches, it was part of Stalin's ascension into power when he became victorious in 1929. So he pursued that policy, and it was part of his him as a politician. And so even if it was an economic failure, Stalin still stood firm. When you compare the famines, they all have in common these social outcomes or ills like corruption, headless competition between different parts, even within the Ukrainian Republic, and passive resistance and stealing and, for example, corruption in Ukraine and this headless competition between the officials on the oblast or district level. That would be grain rotting at the train stations, in the granaries, former churches, tractors, for example, which were pride and joy of industrialization at Kharkiv tractor factory plant. They sometimes wouldn't have even engines inside the tractors. So there was all this, chaos of collectivization and industrialization. It was all present. And I'm sure in Kazakhstan, there were cases like that as well, sometimes of mismanagement that accompanied collectivization. And so I find from what I read of other famines, which reminded me of Ukrainian famine, was the strategies of survival. People stole, people made sometimes controversial decisions about how to survive. They use some substitutes for food and acorns and animals they've never eaten before, or even cannibalism in Ukraine. There was sexual barter, survival prostitution, and there were various strategies of survival. And when the social constraints are lifted, and I think Dicoter, Frank will discuss it more in detail in his presentation. And of course, as Sarah mentioned, there was a colossal transformation of the society, maybe not to the same extent as it was in Kazakhstan, but in Ukraine, there was still a colossal transformation of the countryside. Spatial, for example, churches were closed or turned into granaries or village clubs. There was, we say, the school was transformed, so educational transformation as well. All other institutions of civil society in Ukraine, such as prosvita or enlightenment centers, were closed down after they were established during the revolutionary years or prior to that. Agriculture itself was transformed. What was sown, in what quantities, when it was sown, all the technologies, everything was changing so rapidly during collectivization, and everyday life was changed as well. So it resulted in a way in creation of this Soviet farm worker in Ukraine. If you took, for example, after collectivization, a village in Russia proper, you would find the same elements of the village, of the collective farm, as you would in Ukraine, because there would be a village club, there would be village council, and all the elements will be the same ultimately. So the role of religion was downplayed, the churches were closed, at least visually, and with the loss of churches and temples, part of the original history was gone. So it was just a Soviet village after that. And on, Sarah already mentioned mass violence, and this is where what my research is pretty much about. So I explain it, this endemic mass violence, and Ukraine and Kazakhstan are in this respect similar to other cases of mass violence. when you remove the social constraints and you remove church, you remove non-governmental institution, and when the state controls everything and everyone and disseminates the orders from the top, in any case of mass violence, majority of people would follow the orders. And participation in mass violence in times of war is widespread. And when you think of collectivization as a process as a war in the countryside, it was a grain front, so it was accepted as necessary. And whether it, under certain conditions, especially in European part of Russian Empire, when you see the revolution and the civil war spreading, obviously Ukraine was part of that. So you have violence, people are habituated to violence. 10 years prior to collectivization, violence was there on both sides, rather cycles of violence. So the events of 1917, 1920, and I think China is quite similar to that respect to the Soviet Union. So people were not, to say, accustomed to violence, but it was something they already experienced in the past. So they get used to it in some respect. And during collectivization, we have mass violence. We have disorganized but popular peasant rebellion against collectivization in Ukraine in 1930. There were the whole districts free of Soviet officials, and around 1 million participants in Ukraine alone in this uprising. And Ukraine was the number of uprisings and the number of participants, it was higher than anywhere else in the Soviet Union. So it did pose a problem for the party leadership. So you, apart from the uprising, you have deportations and you have lynching, gratuitous violence of the local officials that followed orders, but sometimes they obviously were too enthusiastic about it. And would they have done that without the policy of grain procurement and collectivization and encouragement from the top? The answer is no. Obviously, people do follow orders. It's part of our evolutionary behavior. So we stay within the group, and this is what Milgram's experiments are about. And more than half of us do that for many, many reasons. So in that respect, I think this is what is similar between all these cases of famines, Ukrainian and Kazakhstan, in China. And but there was also what I find slightly different from Kazakhstan. There was also this established Soviet bureaucracy or modern state already being established in Ukraine, which enabled the famine, such a devastating famine in Ukraine. And this is where it comes to differences. But I come to differences because if you compare even the landscape of Kazakhstan and Ukraine, they're different. You have wooded areas in Ukraine more so than in Kazakhstan. And while Ukraine does have steppe, it does have even the peasants, they were already leading sedentary lifestyle. So they would have some reserves, as Stalin suspected, hidden somewhere. So the very mechanism of the famine had to be well thought through in Ukraine, how to prevent them from accessing food in the fields, in the woods, fishing, you name it. But you had to, if provided we accept that the intention was to starve people, it had to be quite a specific mechanism to ensure that. And obviously they could not escape it, as Sarah discussed, in the Kazakhstan by flight on such a great scale. Even though such cases did exist, peasants did cross the border into Poland, into Romania, and they were stopped at the borders. Some were shot on the spot, but not on the same scale, obviously. And then we have, talking about the differences, we have a very well developed state network of the shops called Torksin in Ukraine that purchased jewelry, gold and silver from the population, and it was conveniently developed during the famine, in particular in Ukraine, with shops which Torksin, so Targovля, the trade with the foreigners, and that's the official name, but it was established in the most remote districts in Ukraine to procure gold from the population, where you could exchange your valuables, your family heirlooms for, well, at extortionate prices for some food, which was a lifeline for some people, obviously. While grain was used to get money for industrialization, research by Osokina shows us that a really significant portion of funding for industrialization in 1933 in the first half was indeed coming from Toroksin, from gold from Toroksin, and in Ukraine in particular. So people were so desperate for food that Toroksin was so successful. Well, along with the raw materials and grain, obviously, but Toroksin did contribute to collectivization. But it also, apart from material, it also relieved the peasants of their family history, because from the survival stories, we see people discussing their Cossack heritage being taken to Toroksin, the Cossack crosses, different awards and medals from the imperial wars. So we can see that being lost. So all this family history, and they turn into these collective farmers au complet. They are at the mercy and will of the Soviet state, and they lost part of their story of personal history. Also, we can see when it comes to distribution of the food, and which I find very fascinating in terms of comparing with Chinese case, is that obviously in China, it will be discussed later, they had this canteens, and peasants were deprived of their utensils, kitchens, pans and pots to cook. In Ukraine, it was not the case. So people still had their houses if they were not evicted, they were not dispossessed or deported. So they still were in their houses with their kitchen, and they could cook, but they had nothing to cook. And the collective farm canteens were en masse, established only in the 1933, when there was a sowing campaign in spring and there was harvest to be done, and people who were strong enough to work were fed in the fields at those collective farm canteens. That is the similarity, but obviously not on the same scale as in China. And we see that people who were not fit for work did not, also like in China, did not receive food. And also there was stratification of food distribution in the industry as well. So we had, all the factories and plants were divided into several groups based on their contribution to the production. So if it was steelworks, they would be in group A, and then it would be B and C, and customer goods, those factories specializing in shoes production, or I don't know, China even, they were at the bottom of this pecking order. And you, let's say if you're a worker at a Berdichev shoe factory, you are more likely to die of hunger than someone working in Donbass in steelworks. And there were indeed cases like that, people dying even on the factory floor from hunger. And finally, I'd like to discuss the differences in descent, which leads us to the key difference, which I argue is crucial for understanding the current memory politics in Ukraine when it comes to making sense of the famine and its importance for the national myth of nation building. So there was resistance, just like in China, and I'm sure there were some local authorities, local officials in Kazakhstan who questioned the orders coming from the top. And there was a really important document discovered by Terry Martin that illustrated that there was dissent in August 1932 when the grain procurement quotas were imposed on Ukraine at the party conference in Kharkiv. And a number of officials that actually in the conference transcripts, I myself read that, questioned these quotas. They said it was unrealistic, especially in Ukraine when there was already famine and people were dying of hunger. But half a year later, in February 1933, we don't see that dissent. We don't see officials questioning what was coming from the Kremlin. How it was achieved? I argue it was achieved through show trials with orders, with pressures from above. And we can see similar developments in China as well. But what Terry Martin discovered, that on the ground in August 1932, when from the conference that was leveraged down, on the ground, collective farm chairman and the heads of the village councils, they were refusing to enforce the policy, refusing to procure grain. Some of them just giving up their party tickets, and because they realized what was happening. Here, their dissent is linked in the correspondence between Stalin, Kaganovich, and Molotov to the national movement. They all talk about the danger of losing Ukraine. There was a famous telegram by Stalin saying, we can lose Ukraine. We need to make a fortress out of it. We need to make an example out of Ukraine. And here we can talk about Ukrainian famine being a unique case, because it is all happening during this period of 1932, 1933. They discuss the Ukraine in geopolitical context of the danger of Pilsudski, Poland invading, and then these kulaks, which Kosior, the first secretary of Ukrainian Central Committee of Ukrainian Communist Bolshevik Party, saying that our kulaks are somewhat different to kulaks in Russia proper. And he says it openly to Stalin in a letter, saying that they are more cultured, they have experienced and they refer to the events of 1919 and this short-lived independence. And indeed, if we look back in history, and this is where we should date the famine, not 1932-33, we can see that Ukrainian kulaks, or shall we say peasants, did not support Bolsheviks. They did not vote for them during the Constituent Assembly elections. They did not vote for them. They overwhelmingly voted for various Ukrainian parties. They did not support collectivization. They opposed it in actively compared to other parts of the Soviet Union. So here, national and social is linked, and this is what makes Ukrainian famine somewhat different from other parts of the Soviet Union, in a way that we see the party leadership responding to that threat by ending abruptly indigenization policy here earlier than in other parts of the Soviet Union. It was stopped in December 1932, and the problems in the countryside were linked to this Ukrainian nationalism. And they discuss it in during the party conferences and private conversation between Stalin, Kaganovich, Molotov, Kosior, and all the party leadership on Republican and obviously the top level until 1933, the end of 1933. So from the party perspective, from Stalin's perspective, this famine within famine did make sense and exacerbating it. And by Ukrainian historians today, which is different to what Sarah discussed, what is happening in Kazakhstan, many interpret it as part of the war of Bolshevik and Stalin, if you like it, against Ukraine. So it was an attack on Ukrainian independence and national movement, if they link it up so well themselves, even though there are no smoking gun documents saying that that's what we wanted to do. But the evidence is there. And that's why in this respect, I think the main key difference is connection between social and national. And we have obviously, we see prosecution of Ukrainian intelligentsia taking place at the same time. There are different show trials, and so it did make sense that the resistance to collectivization, it was linked with nationalism and peasantry being the heart of Ukrainian nationalism, if you adopt Stalin's definition of a nation. So my conclusion is that the link between food and power was something that the Bolsheviks understood really well based on their experience in the Civil War, and in Ukraine, with Ukraine in particular, during and after a revolution. And it was used, it was a political tool, and 1932-33 famine in Ukraine is no different. And Anna Applebaum, for whom this I'm making a caveat here because I was her research assistant, she uses this phrase in her book, Red Famine, saying that even the Bolsheviks themselves in conversation with American journalists and negotiating back in 1921 when there was a famine in the Soviet Union and Americans wanted to provide famine relief, Litvinov, Maxim Litvinov, who later would become, say, foreign minister of the Soviet Union, responded very succinctly to Americans' objections that we are coming to feed, not to fight. Litvinov said, quote, "Yes, but food is a weapon," end of quote. So on that, I would like to finish. And yeah, I welcome all questions and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. And what we're going to do now is we're going to show Frank Dicotter's talk, which includes me asking one question afterwards, just so he got a question. And then after that, we should have plenty of time for questions that hopefully can link the talks together. So, so off we go with Frank.
Well, absolutely delighted to be here. Of course, be much more exciting to speak to a live audience, but here we are, more or less in lockdown. I think the question when it comes to the famine in the People's Republic of China, Mao's Great Famine, 1958 to 62, is where one should start the story. What's the starting point? You could say 1949, when the red flag goes up over Beijing, but I think 1953 might be a better starting point, and for several reasons. It is the year when a man who goes by the name of Joseph Stalin dies. And it has a certain number of implications. First of all, as you probably know, Joseph Stalin came up with the model that all socialist countries wish to emulate. And the model was reasonably straightforward. You take the food from the countryside, you sell it on the international market, and you use the foreign currency that you earn to buy turnkey industries, plants, enterprises that will modernize your country. Now, Stalin did it very well. From 1929 to 33, Moscow was transformed, dazzling visitors from all over the world. And that is the model. And of course, Mao was very keen to emulate it. But since Stalin in the Soviet Union was one of the main funders of the People's Republic, oddly enough, Stalin was the only one capable of somehow restraining Mao. So to some extent, you could say that Stalin's death really was Mao's liberation. And he moves very fast. By the end of 1953, he imposes a monopoly on the grain, meaning that throughout this very large country, hundreds of millions of farmers have to sell the grain they produce to the state at state-mandated prices. They're allowed to retain enough food for their own consumption, which is defined by the state in such a way that they are already virtually on a starvation diet. In the following years, up to roughly 56, they are herded in state farms that very much resemble the collectives established by Joseph Stalin. But there is another reason. When Stalin dies, it is not just the leader in Moscow who vanishes, it is also the man who led the socialist camp. And even before Stalin's death, Mao believed that he really was the key man who had brought a quarter of humanity in the socialist camp, not Stalin. And it was Mao and the Chinese who had fought the imperialist camp to a standstill during the Korean War. So Mao was somehow having his eye on the mantle of leadership of the socialist camp. Of course, it didn't happen. Nikita Khrushchev, a rather coarse erratic man took over, much to Mao's disappointment. Now, Khrushchev invited all the leaders of the socialist camp to Moscow to celebrate the 40th birthday of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1957. In front of all the assembled leaders, Nikita Khrushchev boasted that the Soviet Union would overtake the United States within 10 years in the production of dairy products, milk and butter. Mao saw it as a challenge and didn't even bother to stand up, wagging a finger and saying that China would overtake the United Kingdom in the production of iron and steel within 15 years. This, I think, is the beginning of the Great Leap Forward. I'm not entirely sure Mao knew exactly how he would do it, but one thing is certain. He viewed the wealth of the country in the hundreds of millions of ordinary people in the countryside. So to him, the bridge from socialism into communism, the golden bridge, as he called it, were the people's communes established at the height of 1958, in the summer of 1958, as farmers were herded into even larger collectives where everything was collectivized. It was run very much like an army, man and woman separated, pots and pans confiscated, food distributed by the spoonful in canteens, children sent to collective kindergartens. The point here really is that it was a military model, and the vision was of an army of people where every man, every woman in the countryside became a foot soldier, working around the clock in order to transform the economy overnight and catapult China past its competitors. The idea was that if you could harness that workforce and deploy them day and night, have them work on large water conservancy projects during the slack winter months, have them work in the fields in daytime and forge iron in backyard furnaces in the evening, then you could really have that great leap forward into a society of plenty for all. Well, we know what happened. It went rather pear-shaped. Think of people's communes more as labor camps, where every incentive was taken away from the cultivators. Now, of course, the communes boasted about a massive jump in output, and the food was taken away by the grain inspectors, with the result that tens of millions of people died of hunger. But here, I want to somehow question the very term of famine. It is, I think, a little bit of a misnomer. It implies, certainly in my mind, I understand it, it can be understood in different ways by different people, also in different languages. In German and Dutch, it is even more passive than what famine implies. But nonetheless, the images of absence of food and people waiting for death. And that is not quite what I found when I went into the archives back in 2006, when I started working on the book that would become Mao's Great Famine. On day 2, I came across a very interesting document from Luoding County, a place in Guangdong, which is about 2 hours driving distance from where I am here in Hong Kong. And the report was about hundreds of people being forced to work naked, man and woman alike, in the middle of the winter, of a boy being bound up and thrown into a pond, left to drown, of children locked up in bamboo cages normally used for hogs because that they had fallen asleep during a meeting. What I encountered was violence. And at first I thought this was possibly something quite unique to that particular place. But as I traveled through the country over the following 3 years, I discovered that violence was very much endemic. People were regularly pummeled, beaten, whipped by local cadres underground. Many of them actually died a violent death. Some of them were doused in petrol and set alight. Others were pummeled to death. In Hunan province, the habit of burying people alive was so common that the party secretary of the province, Zhou Xiaozhou, felt obliged to speak out against the habits. It was really a catalogue of horror that I discovered. So then the question really is, how do you explain that violence? Well, I think it really goes back to the principle of the carrots and the stick. There was no carrot left. The incentives had been taken away. The pots and pans and tools of ordinary people in the countryside had been confiscated by the people's communes. The land didn't belong to them. The grain they produced themselves was carted off by the grain inspectors. And their work schedules were defined by a cadre on the ground. They were really at the beck and call of party officials. There was no incentive to work, but the cadres, the party officials, on the other hand, had to really whip up the workforce in one relentless drive after the other in order to increase the grain output and deliver to the state. So people on the one hand, cadres on the other, became locked in some vicious cycle of violence in which the scope, the extent of coercion had to be constantly expanded. It was an orgy of violence in some places, although not everywhere. That's one reason. There was another reason why violence was endemic. It is a fact that people had to be fed, they had to be clothed, they had to be housed, and all of it came at a cost to the collective. In conditions in which there was not enough food to go around, in which even strong men who fulfilled their duties could not be given a proper diet, it was a bleak but logical conclusion to withhold food from those who couldn't contribute to the regime through their labor. You must remember that at the time, people were considered to be mere digits on a balance sheet, a resource to be harnessed and used. The individual was nothing. The state was everything. So in places across the country, those who couldn't work hard enough, those who stole, those who fell asleep, those who were considered to be too weak or sick were eliminated through violence, thereby increasing the food supply to others. Nonetheless, even though by one rough calculation, half of all party officials regularly beat the people they were supposed to serve, the most common weapon was not the fist or the baton or the whip, it was food. Food was used as a weapon. The food supply was controlled by the people's communes, where it was distributed by the spoonful in exchange for work points in collective canteens. People were not allowed to cook at home. So those who were too sick, too old, too vulnerable, pregnant women who couldn't work in the fields, couldn't work enough work points, and were left to starve. Those deemed to be problematic by the regime were simply banned from turning up at the canteen. In other words, what happened was not so much people starving to death, but rather people being starved to death. And I think that is quite a crucial distinction. In other words, rather than a famine, I think we should, at the very least, be speaking of crimes against humanity. Whether it is a genocide or not, a term generally used to describe the famine under Pol Pot is a different issue, which I don't think we should debate now because it will take up too much time. There is another, I think, slight issue with the term famine. It implies destruction of human beings, whereas what we see from 1958 to 62 as a result of radical collectivization is very much the implosion of an entire system. Corruption seeps into every aspect of life with products churned out by factories keen to reach their output target being tainted, whether it is soy sauce or whether it is the steel and concrete that goes into building dams and reservoirs. The transportation system creaks to a halt and then all but collapses by the summer of 1959. Along the railways, in warehouses in Shanghai, goods worth hundreds of millions of yuan are left to rot, sometimes just bags of cement, but also expensive equipment and rare parts for instance, the lorries that are supposed to collect the grain. At the height of the summer 1959, there are enough lorries around in Hunan province to collect the grain that has been so ferociously extracted from the countryside. So you have 140,000 tons that are left by the road to rot, while in that very same province, in some of the villages, people are reduced to foraging for roots or eating the bark of trees or mud in order to just get by, hopefully. Well, that's an extraordinary contrast there. And also an assault on nature, the precise impact of which we will probably never know. But just in terms of, for instance, forest coverage, in some provinces, a province is the size of a large European country or a large state in the United States. In some these provinces, roughly half of all trees are chopped down and disappear for all sorts of reasons, because people run out of energy and want to stay warm, because they can trade it, because they have to feed these backyard furnaces into which their tools and pots and pans are melted down to produce iron, which is too brittle to be transformed into anything helpful. It is truly a monumental waste which characterizes the Great Leap Forward. And then, of course, houses. This may seem odd, but again, I remember reading a report in which houses in the south of China were being torn down to produce fertilizers for the fields. This sounds rather bizarre, but of course, it does make sense. If you have, for instance, a small mud hut in which animals are kept, there will be some organic matter in there. But of course, once there is a drive to produce more fertilizer, villages start competing with others, counties against counties, provinces against provinces. You have a cadre who decides that everything has to be torn down and spread onto the fields. That's one reason. There are others. Here is a man who sees the future beckoning ahead and decides to destroy all houses in his village to rebuild skyscrapers and possibly even an airport. Of course, the plan never migrates from paper onto the ground. People are left without any houses at all. And then, of course, there are also the state inspectors who come to look for hidden food and will not hesitate either to knock down a house or take away the bricks as a form of payment. So when Liu Shaoqi, number 2 after Mao Zedong, visits his home province of Hunan, he writes to Chairman Mao to say that roughly 40% of all the housing in his province has been destroyed. So this is equivalent to a campaign of bombing during the Second World War, except that it's absolutely uniform across entire provinces. I have a few minutes left, and I would like to talk about something else. I think agency is so important. It's not just about the violence inflicted on people, but also how people try to resist and survive at all cost. And of course, resistance starts very much with apathy at work. People try to preserve their energy and do as little as possible. Of course, you got posters with model workers who work all day long. You have loudspeakers in factories with exhortations to work harder, fulfill and over-fulfill the plan, but on the ground, people try to do as little as possible. This is true too in the countryside, where farmers will work under the watchful eye of a passing carder. But the moment that man is gone, it's always a man, they will sit by the side of the field and just wait for the end of their shift. When the village leader actually sides with his people, they are allowed to hibernate through the winter. But even if people become, in many cases, masters of time theft, it's not enough to survive. You really need to steal food. This was put to me by a man I interviewed back in 2008. And he said that if you wanted to survive, you had to steal. And his father refused to steal and died. So stealing starts the moment you are on a field, even before the grain is ripe. You try to steal a clip of wheat. You try to crush the kernels of grain and eat them while they are still green. But there's nowhere where you could cook the food. For starters, you don't have any utensils. They've been confiscated. And of course, it would give you away. So people try to steal as much food straight from the fields as they possibly can. Once the grain has been collected, if the farmers are lucky and local cadres actually side with them, they can, of course, cheat the grain inspectors and deliver a certain amount of grain and hide the rest. Or they can bulk it up with water in order to increase their deliveries. Never mind that the grain that they deliver will rot as a result of the higher water content. Grain on the move is exposed to all sorts of thieving hands. Shippers will replace it with sand. The guards at granaries, of course, will filch as much as they possibly can. And cooks in canteens are the ones to distribute it, of course, to their own family members. Well, stealing is very common. Of course, it isn't just stealing on the sly. There are moments where people in entire counties in the South rise up and begin to fight the Communist Party with the help of local cadres. Zhou Enlai has to deal with some 12 uprisings in the south of China from 1959 to 1961. Parts of Qinghai province actually have to be conquered again with the army moving along the highway. In parts of Gansu province, by 1961, the very depth of the famine, you see thousands of farmers very regularly gather along the railway and force freight trains to come to a full stop. They will strip it of every portion of property they can extract from it. But there is a point, of course, where in this very desolate landscape, there's very little left to steal. There's a point where, unfortunately, and this probably is the greatest tragedy of this whole sinister business, at some point, people turn against each other. They have no alternative but to steal from neighbors or even relatives. I remember a man who we interviewed here in Hong Kong. He spoke Cantonese, so I used a translator. He was a full-grown man. He cried because he remembered that he had stolen food from an elderly relative who had died of hunger a few days later. People turn on each other. I think Primo Levi wrote about it rather eloquently after he managed to survive Auschwitz. What he noticed was that the true heroes were all gone. They were the people that shared food with others. They were the people who would try to look after others. So what Primo Levi noticed was that when people try to survive, there is a change that occurs in the sense of morality. In other words, what happened during the Great Leap Forward is that massive starvation went together with the general collapse of the whole moral fabric of society. Primo Levi called it the gray zone, that zone where no one is truly a perpetrator, no one is truly a victim. And I would say that that entire period could be described as one giant gray zone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. There are far too many questions that I've got for you, and I only have a few minutes in which to do the questions. So what I will begin with here is a really general question about famine, but a famine in, broadly speaking, the modern world since about 1800. So we can bring it into dialogue with the other speakers in the Ukraine and Kazakhstan, but also into the what you might call famine in a sort of post-industrial world or an industrial world. It seems to me that the idea of the passive famine, which we tend to associate with medieval famines where, you know, crops fail and distribution systems are limited and people starve, becomes, in a sense, a rather antiquated way of looking at famine. Famines from Ireland onwards, at least, are, in a sense, episodes of structural violence inflicted by developing economic powers on either their own people or on their colonies or on their peripheral zones. So if we look at, for example, Ireland, there is a quote unquote natural cause in the case of the potato blight, but this is vastly magnified by a project of political economy which effectively regards Ireland as overpopulated, expendable, and ready to be developed. And therefore, these deaths don't matter. And in fact, these deaths are, to some extent, I wouldn't necessarily say deliberately encouraged, but they create a sort of, they're there to create a kind of carte blanche for the British to develop Ireland. So in a sense, it seems as though all of these famines have something in common. The Indian famines, the sort of El Nino famines of the late 19th century, again, are part of this sort of development apparatus. So 2 questions from this. First of all, is there something distinct about famines under 20th century authoritarian regimes, totalitarian regimes, as opposed to these sort of liberal famines of the 19th century? And secondly, to bring us into dialogue with our other speakers, is there still something unique about China? And the question that, just to sort of reframe this, is one thing that is really striking about your book is I'm looking for at least an inkling of a natural cause. Because all famines usually have, at some level, there's a drought, there's a climate crisis, there's a crop disease. I think you mentioned bad harvest maybe once, but a bad harvest ought to be something that a well-organized state can survive. So anyway, it's a sort of long-winded question about the specificity of the Great Leap Forward famine as against these other famines.
Yes, yes. I think it's a whole series of questions that are all very, very good and very difficult too. I think Cecil Woodham Smith has written searingly about the Irish famine. And what struck me in reading that book and others, of course, is that there is something in common with the famines that you can see from the Soviet Union all the way to North Korea. And oddly enough, that's actually ideology, except that these are at different ends of the political spectrum. In the case of Ireland, there's dogmatic belief in laissez-faire. You must not intervene because it will only make it worse, and a refusal to have any empathy towards these people. Those are horrendous. And of course, in the case of the Soviet Union, China, Pol Pot, North Korea, it's the exact opposite. The ideology here is one of the collective. The individual does not matter. It hardly matters. The collective overrides everything. It goes back to what Lenin said to some extent. He who does not work shall not eat. I understand that he meant it in a very different context, but that is very literally applied in the case of the People's Republic of China. So I would say it depends on the kind of political regime. And if I would have to simplify it, then I would say that the 20th century is divided into not an imperialist camp and a socialist camp, but into countries where there's an attempt to separate out powers, and countries where there's an attempt to have a monopoly over power. So in that sense, I put Stalin and Hitler in the same camp. And in countries where there's a monopoly of power, the famine tends to be worse simply because there's nothing left outside of the party that has a monopoly over power. If you go to Bengal under Churchill, the famine during the Second World War in India, then the farmers, poor as they may be, still have their own jewelry that they can trade.
Right.
There might be a landlord that can go and knock on his door and see if they can, strike a deal and that would help them get through that season. There might be churches. There might be some civil society which is there to somehow help, which you will not have in a one-party state. Most of these institutions will have been eliminated quite effectively, whether it is under Stalin, Hitler, or Mao. So to home in more specifically on your last question, is there something very specific about the People's Republic of China? I would say probably not. I mean, yes, in the sense that Kazakhstan is not the Ukraine. And in the same sense that, Sichuan province is not quite the same as Gansu. They're widely different, and there's a great variety across the People's Republic throughout Mao's Great Famine. But nonetheless, it's much easier to hide in a hilly area than it is on a flat rice field where everybody can see you. The north of Beijing, the region known as Manchuria, actually manages to survive quite well. And the main reason is generally because these provinces are led by leaders who somehow don't wish to go along. But overall, there is nothing Chinese about it. You can watch a program about Pol Pot, and you will find out that the majority of the victims were not tortured to death in Slang jail. They're actually taken to the countryside and worked to death. Well, that's a very good program to understand what happened under Mao during the Great Leap Forward. I'm not saying it's interchangeable, but it is structurally quite similar. Now, was there anything natural? 90%. Of course, there must have been a storm somewhere in China in 62. It's a huge country. But let me say that, huge as it may be, it also had a very vast boundary. with the Soviet Union, with Hong Kong, where I am, with Vietnam. None of those countries ever experienced the famine during those years. So, no. Had the whole thing shifted forward or backwards by a few years, it would not have made a big difference.
That's an interesting answer. I have a huge list of questions, but we've already been here for nearly 40 minutes. You need to go to bed, and I'm going to stop the recording here. I want to thank you very, very much for what was a truly, truly fascinating talk. And for anyone out there who hasn't read the book, I urge you to go and read Mao's Great Famine immediately.
Thank you.
All right. How are we doing here? Okay. Right. Well, thanks to Frank. It ends rather abruptly there. What I want to say now is, moderating this, I would like, first of all, to see if Daria and Sarah would like to respond to Frank's talk and to the very general question I asked at the end there, which is about the specificity of 20th century authoritarian famines in the sort of grander history of famine. Is there something particularly awful, as it were, about the kinds of famines we're discussing today? Or do these famines have certain elements in common with, we discussed sort of 19th century colonial famines, for example, but also famines in the longer human past. So and also, and if you'd like to respond to anything in each other's talks or to Frank's talk, off you go.
So maybe is it all right if I start?
Absolutely.
Okay, and you can hear me, good.
Yes, totally, no crackle whatsoever.
Oh boy. Okay, so maybe just a kind of a comment about, my particular case. Well, in Frank's remarks, which are really, I think, very interesting and helpful in response to your question, he stressed that in many authoritarian, regimes, there was a total monopoly on power. And I don't really think that we can say that in the Kazakh case. They did not in any way have control over the Kazakh steppe. They stressed that themselves by saying, look, actually the revolution starts now. We're having a little October. The October revolution didn't happen. There, from the documents I read, they detail how parts of the steppe were run as their own fiefdoms. They were not really controlled by the Communist Party at all. So in that sense, in this particular case, on the fringes of the Soviet regime, I think the issue of control, state control, it looks a bit different. And in turn, people did have, many people were killed fleeing to China, but many people did successfully flee. They fled to other republics. This was a survival strategy they used. I think perhaps another difference to bring out in terms of looking at looking at the cases we're examining today is that, say if you take the Soviet case, they were attempting a very specific form of modernization, one built upon a very rapid transformation of agriculture, one built upon the back of the peasantry. And so I think that's also something specific about, these famines, is that it was, they were attempting a very specific form of modernization, one done very, very, very rapidly. And I think that's also important in terms of sort of differentiating the communist famines we're discussing from some of the other liberal famines we're comparing them against.
Maybe I should address the same comment, if that's okay. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. I would agree with Frank and Sarah that there are similarities, and sometimes you can say there is nothing Chinese or there is nothing Ukrainian about the Holodomor as well as the famine, as far as the famine goes. But I think from the perspective of the party leadership in the Soviet Union, the famine in Ukraine served the aim of taming that part of the Soviet Union that was known for its known to pose a threat to the Soviet authorities. And as we could see during the collectivization, the resistance was strongest in Ukraine, and some parts of Ukraine even got rid of the Soviet officials. There were reports of that. So from that perspective, the uniqueness of Ukrainian case is that, as I mentioned, social and national were a combination of two. Whether it was a genocide, it's a different debate, and Frank mentioned that as well. It's too much to discuss. Yes, so, and you can interpret the Holodomor also as a modernization project as well. So there are so many, it's an interplay of many factors, but I would add national as something that sets it aside.
Mm-hmm. Great. So there's a few questions sort of came in earlier on. I wondered if I might just sort of pick one of them here. And please, I encourage you all to start piling questions into the Q&A function down here to give me. Otherwise, you're going to have to suffer my questions, which you're welcome to listen to. But one question from Michael Goodman, and I think this is something that both Daria and Sarah can discuss. Is the idea of what is the official definition of kulak? And was that definition generally expanded to apply to anyone who was suspect of opposition to collectivization? So Daria, you can answer that, and Sarah, you can obviously discuss the specific sort of Kazakh version of this question.
Do you want to go ahead, Daria?
Well, I will just mention that kulak or kurkul in Ukrainian case, it was the original definition was that the farmer who uses hired labor, but later it was expanded to include everyone who opposed or potentially could oppose Soviet policy on the ground. So it was not necessarily a wealthy farmer with hired labor, but somebody who was involved in trade, or somebody who questioned the policies or did not join the collective or question the policy of collectivization. Yeah.
So there was an equivalent to the campaign against the kulaks in Kazakhstan. It was carried out against the Bai. Bai literally means rich or wealthy. And of course, one of the features of this campaign, like it was across the Soviet Union, is that there was no official definition ever of what a kulak was. And that's part of what made it such a weapon, right? And I think that was quite purposeful. So in Kazakhstan, this campaign really gets going with the Little October, which I mentioned in my presentation, this campaign against Kazakh elites. The campaign, this campaign against the Bai, the Kazakh variant of the kulak, it was both, again, like collectivization itself, I think we can say it was both an economic assault, because in nomadic society, the majority of the livestock was held by the Bai. And so it was an attempt to, because this is how Kazakhs live, the Kazakh nomads live, they held livestock communally. And so the assault against the Bai was an attempt to confiscate all of their livestock. But it was also a kind of cultural assault, right? To wipe out the Bai. These leading figures were often important members of the hereditary elite, important religious figures, and so on. So it was also an attempt to wipe out this sector of Kazakh society. One of the interesting things I found in my research is that many of these members of the hereditary elite were eliminated, but others were not, and they survived the famine.
I would also add to this definition of the kulak from the perspective of cultural history. Soviet Ukrainian writers at the time in 1930s, when they were writing, some of them participants on the ground themselves, were writing about collectivization, they mentioned that there is no set firm definition of kulak, and sometimes you have to use Bolshevik spectacles to detect kulaks on the ground. And that Bolshevik spectacles, it was traveling from novel to novel, which actually demonstrates how difficult it was to find a kulak to fit a definition of kulak.
Battery 90%.
Okay, one second here. Now there's some nonsense going on at my end. I've lost my sound. But you can hear me, correct? Just show me a thumb. Okay, well, I'll ask a question, then I'll sort it out. We have a question here. What is the significance of the movement to garner international recognition of the Ukraine famine as a genocide? And I would add to that question, if I may, just flip it a little bit, something that Sarah talks about. Is it actually useful to ask the question, are these famines genocides? Or is that actually ultimately an unhelpful question? So if you could answer those questions and take your time, because I currently can't hear anyone.
Well, do you want to start maybe, Daria? Because it's the question really started with Ukraine, and then maybe it makes more sense to pivot to Kazakhstan.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I find the whole use of the term genocide as a historian quite limiting, to be honest, because it's one of the interpretations. And it's connected with the firmly with intentions, establishing intentionality behind the famine. Personally speaking, and I do believe that the term genocide is legal term, and it is the case. It should be for lawyers to define whether Holodomor qualifies as a genocide or not. But personally, I see the evidence there for intentionality, even if there are no smoking gun papers, documents. But politicians are ultimately responsible for the policies they pursue. And we see full awareness of the situation on the ground on behalf of Stalin and his close circle. So they were aware of what their policy was leading to, and they persevered. And we can see the cover-up after the famine taking place and denial of the international help. So we can see intent and how they discuss the famine itself being a lesson for the peasants. So we can see intentionality. But is it useful for historians? Historians are preoccupied with the questions of what happened and why, rather than whether it was a genocide. So yeah, that would be my answer, that it's one of the interpretations and it might be fruitful, but the history of the famine should not be limited to that.
So picking up on this, so first to deal with the question of does it matter? Well, I mean, speaking for a lot of the Kazakhs I've talked to over the years, it matters an awful lot to them. It matters an enormous deal because for many Kazakhs, they feel that this is a crisis, a disaster, a crime against humanity that has for too long been shoved under the rug, sidelined by different governments, by different regimes, and so to them, the label of genocide, particularly by the international community, this is finally, a recognition that this disaster existed, that it had meaning, and so on. So for many people in the region, it's an enormously important question. The way I look at it in terms of the Kazakh case is that this was a terrible crime. The Kazakh famine was a terrible crime. It was a crime against humanity that we see them, the regime, as I outlined in my talk today, taking terrible strategies against starving Kazakhs. But I don't see any evidence that these were designed to destroy Kazakhs as an ethnic group as such. Rather, they were political problems. But more broadly, of course, the question of genocide, it depends on what definition you're using. Most historians work with the international definition, with the UN definition. I think if you use the UN definition, then the Kazakh case does not fit, because I have not found any evidence of an intent to destroy Kazakhs as such. The Kazakh case may fit broader definitions, like the one first coined by Raphael Lemkin, which was then hammered into the UN definition. My own personal view of the question of genocide is that, I also tend to think that it's perhaps not as helpful. That if we focus so much on whether the Kazakh case fits the particular definition of genocide, then we may miss some of the peculiarities, and by only focusing on cases that fit a specific definition of genocide, we may exclude the Kazakh case, and that would certainly be very unfortunate, because it's one of the great crimes of the Stalinist regime, as I mentioned.
Thank you so much. So Chris is having some trouble with his speaker, and so I'm going to try to take over a little bit to interact with you guys and with the questions that we have from our panelists or from our audience. One of the things that I think is coming up is a question about sensationalization, and maybe that's part of my worries about the word genocide is when nations and countries end up getting into competitive genocide behavior. That is my genocide better than your genocide, which is really problematic, obviously. Someone asked a question about the sensationalization of the Holodomor around the question of cannibalism, and I know, Daria, you deliberately just said that a little bit and brought it up, but I wondered if you might want to expand on that. Another attendee asks whether you could talk a little more about the commerce or trade posts where the Cossack artifacts went in terms of material culture, which we don't always associate with the horror of famine. That was particularly fascinating. What happened to those collectibles, and where might they have ended up in the open market?
If you don't mind, I will start with the last question about the collectibles and trade posts. Torksin, so trade was foreigners, which were in the case of the Holodomor, trade was the peasants. So indeed, those collectibles that were taken by the peasants to these trade posts were melted. Well, some of them did not melt, and those that traded privately with their neighbors who had food or went to the cities, to the markets, they survived. And it was not only these collectibles, but also embroidered shirts, which Ukraine is Ukrainian national costume, fall costume. So those and embroidered towels, embroidered garments were exchanged for food, and some of them were preserved, and a large amount of them were preserved for that matter, because they were exchanged for food and preserved by other families. But unfortunately, what was procured by the Torksin was melted, and that gives you us the reason to say that that part of material history was lost. Unfortunately, there is very little research on that subject. But on survival strategies, which was mentioned in the other question, I would recommend The Red Famine by Anne Applebaum, who has a chapter dedicated to that matter. And there are many stories, various stories, but for example, there is a work by Oksana Kis on motherhood during the Holodomor, in which she discusses the survival strategies adopted by the women who were in charge of the families. And for example, leaving your child at the orphanage, thinking that the child would have greater chances of survival there, and the state would take care of them, or prioritizing which child within the family to feed who has greater chances of survival, or leaving them with relatives in the cities. And when it comes to food, there are different survival strategies as well, of stretching food to last, or keeping the cow, which by corpora of oral memory is quoted to be the lifeline for many families. And there was a question also what Holodomor means literally, which is death by starvation, death from hunger. Holod means hunger, and mor means death. Yes, and yeah, I think I answered these questions. Yeah.
All right, I'm back now. I apologise for that, and apologise for subjecting you to the sounds of my speaker apparently in the background. I have a question here about how famines end, which is a complicated question because, of course, in terms of memory and so forth, famines never end. But also, I'd like to sort of fold this into a question on food security in Kazakhstan and Ukraine today. I know that as Sarah discusses, how Kazakhstan is a massive wheat exporter today. And so in the case of China, the population's practically tripled and is now feeding itself, although lots of imports, on a much meatier diet than was before, so a much more sort of ecologically demanding diet. So if you could talk about how these famines have ended, but also about today's food situation in the Ukraine and Kazakhstan.
Sarah, would you like to start, or would you like?
Up to you. Go ahead if you'd like.
How the famine ended. This is a very interesting question because parts of Ukraine still experienced a famine in 1933, but overall the famine ended with the new harvest in 1933. The policy was changed from grain procurement plan to tax in January 1933, but only to start with the harvest of 1933. So peasants in Ukraine had to survive to make it till summer 1933, till the next harvest. And that harvest, there was tax, there was a fixed tax to be taken from the produce of that harvest. And also there was decree allowing the peasants to have their vegetable plots next to their houses, which proved to be essential in the Soviet economy until the collapse of the Soviet Union, because most of the vegetables were produced on those small plots in the countryside, private plots. So allowing peasants to keep most of the not most of the harvest, but at least a sizable proportion of the harvest of 1933 helped to overcome the famine, as well as those vegetable plots next to their houses in the countryside. And that's how the famine finished, to say, like acute starvation, but nevertheless the impact, as Sarah discussed in her presentation, the impact was long lasting and people continued to die from hunger related illnesses well into 1934. And that's what the team of Ukrainian demographers were looking at. They look at not 1932-33 losses, but also in excess death rate in 1934 as well.
So in the Kazakh case, I guess probably there are a couple different factors I would put into the mix. One is there's a change in the republic's leadership midway through the famine. So Filip Goloshokin, who was the leader of Kazakhstan at the time, he's ousted. He's publicly blamed by Stalin for the grain shortfall, not for the famine itself, because there was no public, of course, admittance that there was a famine. And he's replaced with a different leader, Levon Mirzayan, an Armenian. And Mirzayan, as far as I've been able to tell, was also a pretty brutal guy. But he, I think, was perhaps a more effective leader, someone who was more attuned to managing some of the republic's problems. He also arguably had more space to operate within, and he was operating under a different set of constraints from Stalin. Another tactic they take is, as the refugee problem becomes essentially unmanageable in Kazakhstan, you have almost every member of Kazakh society on the move. They devote all the resources that had been, so sedentarization, the program of sedentarization, which was wrapped into collectivization, was actually brought back in another guise as a way of solving the refugee problem and of feeding these people and finding work for these people. Because one of the problems that emanated from the famine as it went on was not only, from the regime's perspective, was not only the dramatic drop in livestock, but also just the loss of labor. People were dying. They didn't have enough people to run the collective farms and so on. Finally, another element that I would add in is also good luck, better weather. There was a good harvest in 1934, and that also helped them set them Kazakhstan on this very long and painful road of recovery. So with regards to the food situation in Kazakhstan today, one of the things that really got me interested in the environmental angle of this project is, I was just astonished, thinking about the context that I was reading about in the 1920s, where Kazakhstan is this major meat producer. And then I happened upon a report by the US Department of Agriculture talking about Kazakhstan as this major wheat producer. Even today, however, in its analysis of Kazakhstan, the US Department of Agriculture labels Kazakhstan as a quote unquote risky zone for agriculture, in the sense that even in Kazakhstan today, you see some of the same weather patterns that I outlined in my talk, right? That there's, you can have sharp fluctuations in rainfall, right? That one year might be a very good year, and that will be followed by a bad year. So it's an area where you can have really good harvests, but you can also have harvests that are not as good.
Great, thank you. We have a question here which sort of goes back to the question that I part of the question that I asked Frank, which is the role of quote unquote natural causes. Obviously, famines have multiple causes, but the question here is to what extent were natural causes part of the kind of multiplicity of factors that led to famine? Would these famines did they largely originate from political structural causes? Would they have started even without the natural shocks? So I don't know which one of you wants to go first.
I can address that. I don't think a famine would have happened without, the Soviet regime's intervention. And I think one of the things I tried to do, or I tried to do in my book, is I think for too long in, say, the Soviet field, there has been a debate about the collectivization famines. Was it Stalin's interventions or was it the weather? And
Right.
this actually sets up, to my mind, a really false dichotomy, because when you probe this further, and I looked into the Kazakh case, one of the things that's very clear is that, Stalin and his leadership, they were given very clear warnings about how natural factors in the steppe operated. This was something, in some senses, that they anticipated. People told them, look, this is a really risky decision. You might get a good harvest one year, but you're probably going to get a terrible harvest the next year. A couple of years later, a lot of people are going to die. So this is a risk that they clearly knew about. So we can't, by mentioning that drought and pointedly bringing it up in my presentation, I'm not trying to get Stalin off the hook for it. No, I'm trying to put him on the hook for it and say, this was something that they were clearly aware of.
Yeah, I would agree, Sarah, and I will only add two remarks. First, when we talk about Kazakhstan or Ukraine or China, we are talking about large countries, and you can't argue that the drought would affect the whole country equally. And in case of Ukraine, in 1932 and 1933, we can see a clear border of the famine, so to speak, between Ukraine and Second Polish Republic, where there was no famine at all, and then there was a river, Zbruch, and then we have people starving to death. So likewise, you can argue the second remark would be, even if there is a bad harvest, people would have reserves, and in Ukraine there were no devastating famines like that, unless there was 1921, we can see a drought in the southern Ukraine and civil war, and obviously all the repercussions of the situation. But the second remark is that even if there is a bad harvest, the state can redistribute the resources within the country, as well as ask for international help, or stop grain exports, or sell some of its it happened in the Soviet Union in 1921 when they were selling works of art, antiquity, etc. So nothing of that was done in 1932-33 in the case of Ukraine. And as we know, Sarah probably would say the same for Kazakhstan. Nobody addressed these shortages, euphemisms they used for the famine.
Right. I mean, in 1845, there are plenty of parts of Northern Europe that are hit by potato blight, sort of Belgium, Scotland, but it's only in the south and west of Ireland where conditions are so precarious that this turns into a famine. So even when there seems to be a very obvious natural cause, there's a real engineering of lack of resilience on the part of a population and then that coupled with forced economic development, be this in a liberal or a kind of a command economy kind of way, and refracted through racialized lenses and so forth. These sort of multiple things can transform something that seems natural into something that's profoundly political. Now we've reached the end of our panel, I think, and before someone's computer blows up, it's probably wise and sensible for us to halt here. I'd like to thank our speakers very, very much. I'm giving you a little clap here, and wish you well. And thank you very much to everyone for attending. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all so
Thanks
much.
a lot.
I really, really appreciate it. I think we can say maybe that the subtitle could be Control and Chaos. I was really struck by Chris's comment about engineering a lack of resilience. And we can see that the lack of resilience being engineered precisely by ignoring specialists in favor of slogans and ideology. And that's the tragedy that we saw. Thank you all so much. It's so nice to have such smart people to listen to. I think it's late as well for Daria, so thank you all. We'll see you another time, I hope in person perhaps.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Good luck to you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you again, Andrea, for taking care of the captions. We really appreciate it.